I invited my estranged father to my wedding, and he brought his other family. I spent 10 years convincing myself I didn't need my father, that the silence between us was a choice I'd made for my own peace, not a wound that still ached when I wasn't paying attention. When I got engaged to Daniel, I felt this strange pull to extend an olive branch. Maybe it was the wedding talk, the constant questions about family, or just the hope that people could change. Against my better judgment, I sent him an invitation. I told myself it was the mature thing to do. I told myself I was ready for whatever happened, but I wasn't ready for what walked through those reception hall doors. I wasn't ready for the woman on his arm, the children trailing behind him like ducklings, or the way my mother's face drained of all color. I wasn't ready to discover that the man who abandoned me had built an entire life I knew nothing about. I remember the exact moment my father left. I was 12 years old, sitting on the front steps of our house with a backpack full of school books, waiting for him to come home from work. My mother had made meatloaf, my favorite, and she kept checking the window like she expected him to materialize out of thin air. He never did. Instead, we got a phone call around 8 that night. His voice sounded thin and far away, like he was talking from the bottom of a well. He said he couldn't do it anymore. He said he needed to find himself. He said he was sorry. Then he hung up, and that was it. No forwarding address, no monthly check, no birthday cards that arrived a week late, just a hollow silence that filled our house and stayed there for years. My mother never remarried. She threw herself into her work as a high school English teacher, grading essays late into the night and pretending she wasn't heartbroken. I pretended too. I pretended I didn't care, that I was better off without him, that his absence had made me stronger. But there's a particular kind of loneliness that comes with being the kid whose father walked away. It's the quiet at parent-teacher conferences when they ask about your dad. It's the awkward pause when someone asks what he does for a living. It's the way you learn to smile through conversations about other people's families while your chest tightens into a knot. By the time I turned 25, I had built a good life for myself. I graduated college, landed a steady job in marketing, and met Daniel at a mutual friend's barbecue. He was warm and steady, the kind of man who remembered how I took my coffee and always opened doors without making a show of it. He knew about my father early on, maybe 3 dates in, when I'd had one glass of wine too many, and the whole story spilled out like water from a cracked glass. Daniel listened without interrupting, then took my hand and said, "His loss." That was it. No pity, no probing questions, just quiet acceptance. That was when I knew I'd marry him. The engagement was simple and sweet. Daniel proposed in our living room on a rainy Sunday afternoon, the kind of day where you don't expect anything grand to happen. He'd made pancakes, my favorite, with blueberries, and when I turned around from the stove, he was on one knee with a ring that sparkled even in the gray morning light. I cried, of course. He cried a little too. It was perfect. Planning the wedding was a whirlwind of fabric swatches, cake tastings, and guest lists that seemed to multiply every time I looked at them. My mother threw herself into the planning with a fervor I hadn't seen in years. She was determined to make everything beautiful, maybe because she'd never had her own dream wedding, or maybe because she wanted to pour all her love into mine. We argued over floral arrangements and venue colors, but it was the good kind of arguing, the kind that ended with laughter and takeout. Then came the question of invitations. Daniel's parents were flying in from Arizona. His brother was coming from Chicago. My mother's side of the family was small but enthusiastic. And then there was the blank space where my father's name should go. I stared at that empty line for what felt like hours, my pen hovering over the paper like it might bite me. Daniel noticed my hesitation. He didn't push, just asked gently if I was okay. I said I was fine, but we both knew I wasn't. I debated for weeks. I called my mother, who went quiet on the other end of the line for a long moment before saying, "Honey, it's your day. You do what feels right." That wasn't an answer. It was a polite way of saying she'd support me either way, even if it hurt her. I thought about all the years of silence, all the milestones he'd missed. My high school graduation, my college acceptance letter, my first real job. He hadn't been there for any of it. But part of me, the stubborn, hopeful part I thought I'd buried long ago, still wondered if he'd changed. Still wondered if maybe, just maybe, he regretted walking away. So I sent the invitation. A simple white card with navy lettering, our names, the date, and a note that said we'd love to have him there. I didn't expect a reply. I told myself I was doing it for closure, not for reconciliation. I told myself I was the bigger person, extending grace where none was owed. I didn't tell Daniel about the knot in my stomach or the sleepless nights that followed. Weeks passed. No RSVP, no phone call, no acknowledgement at all. I convinced myself it was for the best. The wedding planning continued, and I buried my disappointment under layers of cake tastings, dress fittings, and seating arrangements. The guest list finalization became a small, quiet act of closure for me. I let myself believe I'd finally put that chapter behind me. The wedding day arrived with a sky so blue it looked painted. The church was decorated with white roses and eucalyptus, the scent thick and sweet in the warm afternoon air. I stood at the altar next to Daniel, his hand warm and steady in mine, my mother beaming from the front row with tears streaming down her cheeks. The ceremony was everything I'd dreamed of. The vows felt sacred. The music floated through the stained glass windows, and for a moment I forgot about the empty seat in the back row where my father might have sat. Then we moved to the reception. The venue was a restored barn with twinkling fairy lights and long wooden tables covered in linen. The champagne was flowing, the laughter was loud, and I was dancing with my new husband when I noticed a commotion near the entrance. My mother had gone still, her champagne glass frozen halfway to her lips. Her face had lost all its color, and her eyes were fixed on the doorway with an expression I couldn't decipher. I turned to look. He was older, graver. The years had etched deep lines around his eyes and turned his hair mostly gray. But I recognized him instantly. My father. He was wearing a pressed suit that didn't quite fit him, and holding the hand of a woman I'd never seen before. Behind them, 3 children shuffled nervously, dressed in matching pastel outfits like they were headed to a school photo. The oldest looked about 10. The youngest couldn't have been more than 5. My father's eyes found mine across the room, and he smiled like everything was perfectly normal. Like he hadn't disappeared from my life 13 years ago. Like he hadn't missed every important moment I'd ever had. Like he hadn't just brought a whole new family to my wedding without so much as a warning. The music kept playing, but I couldn't hear it anymore. My heart was pounding so loud it drowned out everything else. Daniel squeezed my hand, his brow furrowed with concern. "Is that him?" he asked quietly. I couldn't speak. I could only watch as my father walked toward us, his new family trailing behind him like ghosts from a life I never knew existed. And in that moment, standing there in my white dress with my new husband by my side, I realized that the man I'd spent 10 years convincing myself I didn't need had just arrived to prove me wrong in the cruelest way possible. The reception hall felt like it was shrinking around me. The fairy lights that had seemed so warm and magical moments before now felt harsh and glaring. I could hear the faint hum of conversation from our guests, the clinking of glasses, the distant melody of the live band we'd hired, but all of it sounded muffled, like I was underwater. My father was walking toward me, and with every step he took, the floor seemed to tilt beneath my feet. Daniel's hand was still wrapped around mine, grounding me. He leaned in close, his voice low and steady. "Do you want me to handle this?" he asked. "I can ask them to leave. I can tell the staff—" "No," I heard myself say. The word came out sharper than I intended. "No, I need to see what he wants." My father stopped about 6 feet away from us. Up close, I could see the details I'd missed from across the room. The creases around his eyes were deeper than I remembered. His suit jacket was slightly too tight across the shoulders. He looked older, tired, and somehow smaller than the man who had walked out of my life all those years ago. "Emily," he said. My name sounded strange in his voice, like he was testing it out to see if it still fit. "You look beautiful, just like your mother did on our wedding day." I felt a sharp sting at that comment, a mix of anger and something more complicated. He had no right to mention my mother. Not here, not now, not after everything. I glanced past him at the woman and children standing awkwardly behind him. The woman had a nervous smile on her face, the kind that didn't reach her eyes. The children were fidgeting, the youngest tugging at the woman's dress and whispering something I couldn't hear. "Who are these people?" I asked. My voice was steady, which surprised me. Inside, I was trembling. My father's smile faltered. He glanced back at his family, then at me, and I saw something flicker in his eyes. Embarrassment? Guilt? It was gone before I could identify it. "Emily, I want you to meet my wife, Patricia. And these are my children. Well, our children. This is Leo, he's 10. And Grace, she's 7. And little Mia, she's 5. I stared at him. The words didn't quite register. His wife, his children. He had a wife. He had children. He had built an entire family, a whole life, while I was mourning the father I'd lost. While my mother was grading papers alone in our quiet house. While I was learning to fill the void he'd left behind. "You have children," I said flatly. It wasn't a question. Patricia stepped forward, extending her hand with that same nervous smile. "Emily, we've heard so much about you. Your father—" "Stop." I held up my hand and she froze. The music was still playing somewhere behind me, but it felt like a distant soundtrack to a movie I wasn't watching. "You've heard about me? You've heard about me, but I've never heard about you. None of you. He never mentioned any of you, not once. Not in 13 years. My father opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked at his wife, then at his children, then back at me. "Emily, I know this is a shock. I know I should have called first, or written, or you should have done a lot of things." I cut him off. My voice was rising now, and I could feel the eyes of our guests on us. I saw my mother out of the corner of my eye. She had turned away, her shoulders shaking. Daniel's brother was walking toward her, a protective hand on her arm. I forced myself to take a breath. I wasn't going to make a scene. Not here. Not at my own wedding. I had dreamed about this day for so long, and I refused to let him ruin it. Daniel squeezed my hand again. He didn't say anything, but I could feel his support through his touch. He was my anchor. He was the reason I could keep my composure. "Okay," I said, more calmly. Okay, you're here, you came. You brought your family. What exactly do you want from me? My father looked genuinely taken aback by the question. He glanced at Patricia again, as if she might have the answer. She gave him a small, encouraging nod. He turned back to me. I wanted to see you get married. I wanted to be part of your day. I know I messed up. I know I made terrible choices. But I've been thinking about you for years, Emily. Wondering how you were. Hoping you were happy. When I got your invitation, I thought maybe this was my chance. My chance to apologize. To try to make things right. I felt a bitter laugh bubble up in my throat, but I swallowed it down. You thought showing up unannounced with a wife and kids I didn't know existed was the way to make things right? You thought that would be a good apology? Patricia spoke up, her voice soft and placating. Emily, please. He's been so nervous about this. He wanted to tell you so many times, but he was afraid. Afraid you'd reject him. Afraid you wouldn't understand. Understand what? I asked, turning to her. That he left me when I was 12 years old and never looked back. That he missed every birthday, every holiday, every school play, every single moment that mattered, that my mother spent years crying herself to sleep while he was out there starting a new life with someone else. Mia, the youngest, started to cry. Patricia knelt down to comfort her, whispering something I couldn't hear. Leo, the oldest boy, stared at the floor with a sullen expression. Grace was looking at me with wide, frightened eyes. They were just kids. They hadn't asked for any of this. I felt a sudden pang of guilt for my outburst. I took another breath, steadying myself. Look, I said, my voice softer now. This isn't the time or the place. This is my wedding. These are my guests. I don't want to cause a scene. My father nodded quickly. Of course. We can talk later. I understand. Talk later? I shook my head. No, I don't think we're going to talk later. I don't think we're going to talk at all. He looked stricken. Emily, please. I held up my hand again. Please, just go. I'm asking you as your daughter to please leave. I can't do this right now. I won't do this right now. There was a long silence. The band had finally stopped playing. Everyone was watching, but I didn't care anymore. All I cared about was getting through this moment without completely falling apart. Patricia tugged gently on my father's sleeve. Come on, she whispered. Let's go. He hesitated for a moment, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Then he nodded slowly. Okay, he said quietly. I'm sorry, Emily, for everything. He turned and walked away, his new family trailing behind him. I watched them go until they disappeared through the reception hall doors. The silence stretched on for a moment longer, and then someone started clapping. I didn't know who. The music started up again. People went back to their conversations, pretending they hadn't seen anything. Daniel pulled me into his arms, holding me tight. You did so well, he murmured against my hair. I'm so proud of you. I buried my face in his chest and let myself cry. Quiet tears that no one else could see. It wasn't the way I'd imagined my wedding day, but then again, I should have known better. I should have known that inviting my father back into my life would only bring more pain. He'd left me once. I should never have given him the chance to leave me again. The rest of the reception passed in a blur. I don't remember much about it, to be honest. I remember Daniel's hand never leaving mine. I remember my mother coming over to hug me, her eyes red-rimmed but her smile brave and reassuring. She told me I was stronger than I knew. She told me I had done the right thing. She didn't mention my father, and I didn't ask her to. Some wounds are too deep to poke at, especially on a day that was supposed to be about joy. I remember the cake cutting, the first dance, the bouquet toss. I smiled for the photographer. I laughed at Daniel's uncle's terrible jokes. I danced with my new husband and pretended that my heart wasn't still racing from the confrontation. But underneath it all, I was processing. My mind kept circling back to my father's face, to the way he'd looked at me when I told him to leave. There had been regret there, I think, maybe even shame. But it didn't change anything. It didn't erase the years of silence. When the reception finally ended and we drove to our hotel, I collapsed onto the bed in my wedding dress and stared at the ceiling. Daniel sat beside me, his hand on my back, tracing slow circles. He didn't rush me to talk. He just waited. I gave him 13 years, I finally said. 13 years to call? 13 years to show up. And he chose now, at my wedding, with his new family. Daniel was quiet for a moment, then said, maybe he thought it was his last chance. Maybe he was scared. I sat up, incredulous. He left me. He was the one who left. I was the one who was scared. I was the one who spent years wondering what I did wrong. If I wasn't good enough, if I wasn't worth staying for. Daniel pulled me into his arms. You were always enough. He was the one who wasn't enough. He was the one who wasn't strong enough to stay. That's not your fault. That was never your fault, I cried then, really cried for the first time in years. I cried for the 12-year-old girl who waited on the front steps. I cried for my mother who deserved so much better. I cried for the version of myself who had spent so long believing she was unlovable. And when the tears finally stopped, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Relief, like I'd been carrying a heavy weight on my shoulders and had finally set it down. The next morning, I woke up in Daniel's arms. The sun was streaming through the hotel curtains, and for a brief, beautiful moment, everything felt normal. Then the memories came flooding back. The reception, my father, Patricia, the children. I checked my phone. There was a text from an unknown number. I opened it and read the message. Emily, it's your father. I know you don't want to talk to me, and I understand. I just wanted to say thank you for letting us come. I know I didn't deserve it. I know I don't deserve a second chance. But I want you to know that I've regretted leaving every single day. I've watched you from a distance. I've seen your graduation photos online. I've read about your job. I've seen pictures of you and Daniel. I've never stopped loving you. I was just too much of a coward to say it. I won't bother you again unless you want me to. But if you ever decide you're ready to talk, I'll be here. I'll always be here. I'm sorry for everything. I love you. I read the message 3 times. Each time I felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness, not yet, but something close to understanding. He had been a coward. He had made terrible choices. He had hurt me in ways that would take a long time to heal, but he was also a flawed human being who had finally, after all these years, admitted his mistakes. Daniel peered over my shoulder. What does it say? I handed him the phone without a word. He read the message slowly, then looked up at me. What do you want to do? That was the question, wasn't it? What did I want? I could ignore the message. I could block the number. I could pretend that my father had never reached out, that he was still the same distant figure who had walked away all those years ago. Or I could take a risk. I could open the door just a crack and see what happened. I thought about my mother. She had spent years being angry at my father, and she had every right to be. But she had also taught me something important. She had taught me that holding on to anger was like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. It didn't hurt him. It only hurt me. I don't know, I admitted. Part of me wants to just forget about him. Move on with my life. I have Daniel. I have my mom. I have a good job and a beautiful future. I don't need him. But Daniel prompted, but part of me wants to hear what he has to say. Not for him, for me. I want to know why he left. I want to understand. I think I need to understand. Daniel nodded slowly. Then do it. But on your terms, on your timeline. You don't owe him anything. You don't have to forgive him. You don't have to let him back into your life. But if you need answers, you deserve to get them. I smiled at my husband. He was so steady, so patient, so good. I didn't know how I'd gotten so lucky. A few weeks later, after the honeymoon, after the excitement of being newlyweds had settled into a comfortable routine, I picked up my phone. I stared at the unknown number, my father's number. I took a deep breath and hit call. He answered on the second ring. Hello? It's Emily, I said. My voice was steady. I'm ready to talk. There was a pause on the other end. And then I heard him exhale, a shaky breath that sounded almost like relief. Thank you, he said quietly. Thank you for calling. We talked for over 2 hours that day. He told me about Patricia, how they'd met a few years after he left. He told me about his job, his new life, his regrets. He told me about the letters he'd written to me but never sent. The times he'd driven past our old house but never knocked. He didn't make excuses. He didn't blame anyone but himself. In the end, I didn't forgive him. Not fully. Maybe I never would. But I understood him a little better. And I realized that forgiveness wasn't something I owed him. It was something I owed myself. Letting go of the anger didn't mean I was okay with what he'd done. It just meant I was tired of carrying it. I ended the call feeling lighter. Not healed, but healing. And for now, that was enough.